China's rise are internal reforms under Deng Xiaoping, when he abandons certain communist principles of economic management and gets much more productive agricultural sector and industry and commerce. And so China's running double-digit growth rates for about 20 years with significant compounding effects. Okay, that's the story of China's rise. Now for this dystopian alternate universe of Russian decline. You have pictured here on the left is Leonid Brezhnev, who apparently had a stroke in 1976 that permanently impaired his thinking, and which his death in 1982 finished off. And then he was replaced by Yuri Andropov, whose own health was pretty parlous, and he dies within 2 years. And then Konstantin Chernenko barely makes it a year before he's dead. I mean, it sort of sounds like us. But anyway, it doesn't work well. So if you look at Soviet growth statistics, they're really good right after the end of World War II. They're busy rebuilding. But then when you get to the mid-'70s, they're going into terminal decline. So when Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, Soviet growth rates have been either 1% to 2% less than U.S. growth rates for the preceding decade. And the compounding effects of that are pretty horrendous. In addition, other problems, Leonid Brezhnev was in power for 18 long years. And not only did he collect cars, that was apparently the go-to gift for him, but in addition, he was collecting a bunch of non-performing PALs across the third world because this is manifesting Russian power, but it's expensive, and he doesn't have much of an economy to pay for it. And if you look at oil prices, they're very much associated with the decline of the Soviet Union, rise of Vladimir Putin. And it's because in the Soviet era, government budgets relied as much as 55% on oil or energy revenues. And so piggy banks are going to shrink if oil prices aren't doing very well. And so Gorbachev repeatedly said, we can't live this way anymore. And so he wanted, and he did, initiate political and economic reforms to try to save communism, except he really ruined the sclerotic patient doing what he did. And there are massive territorial implications for what he did. And it's the loss of empire in Eastern Europe and also the loss of the ethnically based constituent republics of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to show you this Russia's territorial odyssey in maps. So this is 38. It is before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Nazi-Soviet pact, where they're dividing up Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, Nazis and Soviets, of what they want. This is before then. But by the time you get to the end of the war, Russia's got the Baltic states, it's got Kaliningrad, it's got all of Belarus, all of Ukraine. And then, of course, it gets Eastern Europe. Well, with Gorbachev, after he works his magic, you're down to Kaliningrad. Okay, that's where Russians stage a lot of weapons nowadays and apparently dump a lot of toxic waste. So that's what Kaliningrad's all about. So it's significant, so that at the end of 1991, when Russia's lost everything, they're down to a much diminished rump state, and then followed by years of instability in Russia.
Mercury is my banking platform, and I basically use it to run this whole business. I use it to invoice my sponsors and to automatically pay bills. I even have payroll set up with recurring payments going out to all my editors. But maybe it's not intuitive why it's so helpful to have all of these things run through the same platform. So let me give you an example. As my business has gotten more complicated, in order to figure out how much money I'll have in a week or a month in the future, I need to know not just how much cash we have on hand, but also what our open invoices are with sponsors and what bills we owe to other people. With Mercury, I can easily figure out this number by taking our current cash balance and then netting it out with all our open invoices and upcoming bills, all added up, which Mercury tallies for me. And this is actually super valuable. Sometimes I like to make crazy YOLO AI bets, and Mercury makes me feel super confident about exactly how much money I can take out of our business while still having enough left over to pay bills and to pay taxes. Visit Mercury.com to join me and 200,000 other entrepreneurs who use Mercury. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided through Choice Financial Group, Column NA, and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC.
When Russians measure, they agree on that their country always has been, always should be, always will be a great power. But they don't measure it in wealth because their wealth has always been much less than their westward neighbors, although they often confiscate the wealth of other people. So what they measure, their strength, greatness, is in vast territorial extent and the ability to run roughshod over others and make them do whatever it is Russia wants. And also, when they look at their security, they also look at it this way, is that we need this vast territorial extent to be secure. But they never turn it around, so they're always worried about other people invading them, to think, well, do you suppose we pose a threat to anybody else? They never turn it around that way, except Russia has posed existential threat to its neighbors forever. There are so many neighbors you have never heard of because they've disappeared from the pages of history, courtesy of the Russians. Let's go to the medieval period, where Russia starts out as the princely state of Muscovy, Moscow. Well, it wipes out the other princely states. There was Novgorod the Great. It was the more progressive place. They wiped that place out. Pskov, Rostov, Tver, there are a lot of other places. And then later they're eliminating the khanates of Central Asia. These are states. It's a different way of organizing yourself. But the Khanate of Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, Kokand, Khiva, Bukhara, they get rid of all of it. And then there's been this repeated vivisecting of European neighbors, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Finland, of taking their territory one bite at a time. And you can see it going on today. And the Russians just don't see it, that if you do this to other people, this is why at the end of the Cold War, everyone is stampeding into NATO. It's not some conspiracy. It's just what the Russians have done to them. And now I'm going to illustrate Poland's fate to show what happens when you're surrounded by rapacious continental empires. 3 partitions of Poland in the 18th century. This is when Prussia, Austria, and Russia are taking things. The Russians say, but we didn't take Polish territory. They're taking the Polish Empire. It's a technicality. If you wonder why Poles cannot stand Russians, it would be this, and it would also be the genocide-laced occupation of Poland that went on for several generations after World War II. And part of that, Yalta, again, the Russians insisted on moving Poland 200 kilometers to the west. That is not the normal thing to do to a country. So it's deep into German territory, so Russia can go eat a big part of Poland. Then Russia decides it's going to cleanse the whole place, ethnically cleanse. So Germans are going to live in Germany, Poles are going to live in Poland, Ukrainian are going to live in Ukraine, and millions of people, this is a war-devastated Europe where there's no way to take care of refugees, are being sent hither and yon, and lots of them are dying. And for the first time in their histories, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, they become ethnically homogeneous states. And then Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia require Russian troops to hang on to some of their current gains. So a lot of things go on here. If you compare to what the West is doing in the United States has the Marshall Plan, you've heard of it, where the United States is pouring aid into our Western allies to restore them after the war. Well, this is what Russia's doing. They've won the war, so their troops are there, but they never take their troops home. Then they're busy running coups. Then they're busy shooting anyone who disagrees with them, or they send them to labor camps, whatever they're going to do. And then they redistribute every form of wealth there is, either through nationalization or collectivization, right? And they're imposing this really non-functioning economic model on these people. It's called communism. It doesn't work. So you wonder why Eastern Europeans aren't thrilled about a repeat of this? Well, come on. All right. Moreover, story gets better. The people who made all this happen include this charmer, some of the most toxic people from the Soviet Union. Andrei Vyshinsky, who goes to Romania, lucky Romanians, he was running the show trials that were killing sending the original Bolshevik leaders summary execution. What does he do when he gets to Romania? Well, he appoints the ministers of justice, war, and the interior. If you do that, you control the courts, army, and police, and then you can start expropriating everything and nationalizing things, and you can start eliminating other parties, and you make Romania trade only with the Soviet Union. Okay. All right, another toxic personality, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, he's another part of the A-list purge team. What had he done? Signed loads of execution warrants to his military colleagues, officers, during the Great Purges. What a great guy. He's in Hungary, lucky people. He's not quite as competent as the other one, because in the elections of 1945 in Hungary, the Smallholders Party wins. Oops, they aren't communists. He doesn't ever make that mistake again. Then he's busily appointing communist ministers to different ministries, the land reform, taking over the civil service, getting the propaganda up and running, taking over youth and women's groups to infiltrate that way, and arresting all sorts of non-communist politicians before he holds the 1947 elections, which of course the communists win. And then afterwards, there's a really big purge, which 10% of the population faces tribunals. Think of that. If this room, 10% of you going to tribunals because Russians are in town, okay. Russia had a template for block building. I'm giving you the details because you get a sense of how a continental empire runs business. So the Russians looked at how, when Italy surrendered to Western Western allies, that they basically just ran the show in Italy. So the Russians are going, well, when we accept surrenders, we're going to run the show in Eastern Europe. But the Russians want to take advantage of the absolute turmoil that wars cause. Also, wars often lead to war economies where you've got a lot of centralized government control to run the war effort. So the Russians want to leverage that one. And then they've got this big Red Army presence. Use all of those things, which they do. And here's their template. They're controlling the power ministries. What are they? Defense and interior. If you do that, you're going to monopolize coercion and eliminate your opposition. If you control the justice and information ministries, you can arrest or kill at will, and then you control all the stories that are never told about this. And then if you control agriculture, particularly in those days, you're going to buy a lot of allegiance by redistributing other people's lands, and that's going to wipe out class enemies, collaborators, all sorts of people you don't like, and the original elite that have been running rural areas. And they also had a story that they told about this. It's the big lie. Remember communism? What is the really bad people in the communist story of how we all live? It's the imperialists, right? Imperialism's really bad. Well, I've just shown you that Russians were the greatest practitioners of imperialism of the 20th century. And they're doing this right as Western imperialists are giving up their colonies. And yet this big lie, the big fiction that the Russians are somehow nice guys, they're using democratic forms. Like, they don't eliminate Poland as a state, as the czars had done. It's still called Poland, but it's a fiction that it's independent. It's not. And there's a fiction that they hold elections, but they're not democratic. We already know the outcome. And it's a dictatorship in reality, and they're just purging the place. I mean, they're killing lots of Eastern Europeans. So if you think Eastern Europeans don't remember this, they most certainly do. And then there's a more regional template for how you do this. I've already talked about ethnic cleansing. They did that. And then they tried moving countries, right? Poland to the west, Mongolia, I haven't talked about. It was to the east into Chinese territory. And then they want to take some stepping stones for later expansion. So that's what Kaliningrad is all about. Another one is Moldova. That is territory between Romania and Russia on very important river systems. And Moldova's got problems with a place called Transnistria, which the Russians have poached. So that story's still ongoing. And also places like Azerbaijan, it's split between Iran and, now it's independent Azerbaijan, but it was split with the Soviet Union. And then there are the divided states of Germany, Korea, Mongolia, and China. You want all your neighbors quarreling over their borders so that Russia can then set the terms and that it can nibble them away a bite at a time, or if it can take a whole thing, good for them.